History as it happens, August 3rd, 2021. Cuba, Biden, and the burden of history.
I have emphasized before that this was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Darnos por vencidos, renunciar a la revolución.
Since communists took over Cuba, the United States has punished that country with an embargo for 60 years, yet the communist regime endures. Stunning street protests raised hope Cubans might finally win some freedom, but a police crackdown led to mass arrests, and the U.S. fell back on an old, ineffective tool, more sanctions. The Cold War ended 30 years ago. Isn't it time to try something new? That's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And though this policy has been rooted in the best of intentions, no other nation joins us in imposing these sanctions, and it has had little effect beyond providing the Cuban government with a rationale for restrictions on its people.
The United States is going to continue to stand with the Cuban people who have suffered decades under a failed communist regime.
Fidel Castro outlasted 9 U.S. presidents. That's something no one might have expected when his revolutionaries toppled the regime of the U.S.-backed strongman Fulgencio Batista in 1959.
From his stronghold in the wild Sierra Maestre Mountains, Cuba's Fidel Castro emerged triumphant after 2 years of guerrilla warfare against the Batista regime. The revolution that began with Castro a fugitive, practically alone, landing with 82 followers, to be nearly wiped out by government forces, ended with the flight of dictator Fulgencio Batista.
When John Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he criticized Eisenhower for supporting Batista. Kennedy said Fulgencio Batista murdered 20,000 Cubans in 7 years, and he turned democratic Cuba into a complete police state, destroying every individual liberty. Well, soon Kennedy would be saying much the same about Castro, as his administration and everyone to follow could simply not abide a communist government 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Kennedy would try and fail to topple Castro at the Bay of Pigs.
Nor would we expect or accept the same outcome which this small band of gallant Cuban refugees must have known that they were chancing, determined as they were against heavy odds to pursue their courageous attempts to regain their island's freedom.
That led to a crisis which brought the superpowers to the precipice of nuclear war.
Shortly after the president's speech tonight, the Defense Department said it would begin almost immediately to search and sink, if necessary, the ships of any nation carrying offensive weapons to Cuba. Soviet bloc ships are reportedly on their way there now. That report and the president's address to the nation...
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas.
Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, assassination plots, exploding cigars, all of this seems so long ago, part of a bygone era. Well, the Cold War has been over for a generation, but a couple of things have not changed. Cuba is still communist, and the U.S. still punishes Cuba for that reason. It's as if this part of the world is locked in the past century, impervious to changes in geopolitics affecting every other part of the globe, as if every American president is obligated to carry the burden of an ineffective policy toward Cuba. At least that's how things look in the United States. Much of the rest of the world has moved on. Barack Obama tried. He did try to bring U.S. Cuba relations into the 21st century because he said the old way of doing things wasn't working.
Today, Cuba is still governed by the Castros and the Communist Party that came to power half a century ago. Neither the American nor Cuban people are well served by a rigid policy that's rooted in events that took place before most of us were born.
But Obama's initiative to normalize relations and end the embargo was short-lived. The Trump administration reversed his policies, and Cuba pretty much disappeared from the headlines until early July. Thousands of Cubans took to the streets protesting food and power shortages and a delayed COVID inoculation campaign. They were the biggest protests in decades and led to a ferocious police crackdown. The demonstrators will be prosecuted in mass trials, and the story has slipped from the headlines almost as quickly as it appeared.
And I think the United States allows the regime to have not only a crutch for its economic inefficiencies, but also it can claim, well, any protesters, they're U.S. lackeys.
That's Ivan Eland, a scholar of American foreign policy at the Independent Institute. He says it's time for the U.S. to stop taking counterproductive measures against Cuba, such as sanctions, measures that seem to have been drawn up when the Soviet Union existed. My conversation with Ivan Eland is coming up in a moment. First, we're going to say hello to Washington Times National Security Team Leader Guy Taylor for an update on what the Biden administration is doing here. Guy Taylor, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for having me.
Well, Guy, the last time we spoke, we had an extended conversation about Joe Biden's foreign policy, and I don't believe Cuba came up. That was one of the themes of our talk, how events shape presidencies, not the other way around. And these protests came as a surprise to many people in the United States. So let's talk about the sanctions the Biden administration has put in place here. What are they, and what's their desired effect?
Well, the sanctions are pretty surgical. They're supposed to be about targeting people that were involved in this crackdown on protests. And they're supposed to be an attempt to show solidarity between the U.S. and the protesters by basically sending a message that the crackdown was authoritarian and too aggressive, and that this kind of mass arrests of demonstrators is something that the United States won't tolerate in this hemisphere.
Was the administration reacting to domestic political pressure in imposing the sanctions? There's obviously a significant Cuban-American presence in Florida, to name one place.
Absolutely, Martin. It cannot be overstated how much U.S. Cuba policy is rooted in trying to win this electoral swing state, this very important state of Florida, which has a huge Latin American population, but also Cuban American population, people whose parents and grandparents fled the Castro regime in Cuba and have long pressured the White House, regardless of who's in it, to pursue a policy of regime change. Senators like Marco Rubio, but also even some on the Democrat side, people like Bob Menendez, a Democrat up in New Jersey who's very influential on foreign policy. Look, if you stand against this important voting bloc in Florida, you stand to lose Florida in an election.
So Barack Obama did try something new with Cuba, but his policies were reversed by the Trump administration. We haven't heard much about Cuba, generally speaking, in the United States when it comes to foreign policy issues. Where was Cuba fitting in the Biden administration's agenda before these protests hit?
I think it was definitely on the radar of the political team attached to Biden himself. I don't think that Biden wanted to talk about it very much because Biden's personal position on Cuba is clearly different from where his former boss, President Obama, was. Obama's approach was very much one of let's pursue a détente, let's even try to lift the embargo that's been in place for longer than you and I have been alive, and let's try to reach out and even shake hands with the Castros if we need to. It's time to move on. You know, that was Obama's approach. But Biden's approach is very much more to stand up for human rights activists in the region. This wasn't something where everybody said, well, there are going to be protests in Cuba. It's about to happen. Miguel Diaz-Canel doesn't have control of the country. No, what happened was a bit of shock, where suddenly there were demonstrations. Suddenly the demonstrations were bigger. Suddenly the demonstrations were in more than a dozen cities and towns. And suddenly, within 24 hours, people were talking about the downfall of the Cuban regime. This is something that people in the White House were pretty shocked by. The look was, we got to come up with a coherent policy here. Initially, it was wait and see, and now you're seeing it build gradually towards, we're not going to lift the embargo, we're going to impose sanctions on the Diaz-Canel regime to try and pressure the Diaz-Canel government to possibly engage in some really aggressive reforms, maybe even call for elections. That I think is the hope of the Biden administration. It's that these sanctions will send a message. Hey, you have a chance right now to do something historic.
The track record of sanctions in trying to persuade or convince a country to change its behavior, in this case Cuba, over the past 60 years isn't very good.
No, and a lot of that has to do, Martin, with the fact that the Cuban government under the Castro brothers was effective and also had support from the former Soviet Union and then from revanchist Russia, has really strong relationships with other leftist governments in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, we're even seeing now with Diaz-Canel in the presidency in Havana, he's got a lot of support from the president of Mexico. Rhetorically, at least, Lopez Obrador is saying, hey, look, I'm with you. I'm going to pressure the Americans to lift the embargo. This is very interesting. And we Americans, centrists, conservatives, liberals, people in the Washington establishment, I think we forget that around the hemisphere and around the world, there are governments that would support a communist regime in Cuba. And to flip it around on you, I don't necessarily like this analogy, but people often point out, look, the United States stands up for, say, a hyper-capitalist government in Taiwan. On the edge of this massive communist autocracy that is China. There are autocratic governments in the East that would stand up for a communist state-controlled government in Cuba just to roil the United States a few miles away to the north.
And in the meantime, the protests have been put to a stop.
Look, that's a really important part of the story here. These protests were big and shocking. They lasted a day. And we're almost a month on now. I've had to do this with our staff at the Washington Times, with others writing about it, and say, hey, the protests aren't going on today. They're not still happening. It wasn't yesterday. We need to make sure we clarify in our coverage that this happened for one day. You'll turn on CNN and you'll see a presentation, or Fox, as if they're still going on right now. So the reality is that's a message that the Cuban American population that wants regime change in Cuba is trying to perpetuate with their own demonstrations that are happening in front of the White House almost every day, happening across Florida. They're big in Miami. It is definitely interesting to me how big the Cuban American uprising has been. I think it's really important because it's also not just a group of angry older people who feel connected to their parents and grandparents' old lives in pre-Castro Cuba. You're talking about young people almost like going out to concerts that are protests saying Cuba Libre.
Free Cuba. Well, Guy Taylor, we thank you for your insights. Guy's work covering international affairs can be found at WashingtonTimes.com. So when it comes to freeing Cuba, our next guest says the U.S. must resist the urge to meddle in Cuba's affairs and instead trust the Cuban people to decide what government they should have. Ivan Eland is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, and he is the director of the Institute's Center on Peace and Liberty. He is the author of many works on U.S. foreign policy, including War and the Rogue Presidency, Restoring the Republic After Congressional Failure. Ivan Eland, welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's begin with the street protests in Cuba. What caused them? Who are the protesters? Are they members of an organized opposition, or are they just ordinary citizens who've had enough?
Well, I think it's the latter. It's the ordinary citizens that have had enough. You know, of course, they have the COVID problem where they're not getting vaccine, but it's a larger problem. They're not getting medical supplies. There's not enough food. Prices are going up. Part of that's the pandemic. And of course, the main problem that they're having is the pandemic has lost a lot of their tourist business. And that's what they depend on for a lot of incoming cash. So this is causing all sorts of problems. U.S. sanctions were increased during the Trump administration, and they've been maintained by the Biden administration. And Biden is just now saying he's going to ratchet up more sanctions on particular people that are involved in suppressing the protests. I think the sanctions have probably had less of an effect on the economy than communist systems, inefficiencies, and also, as I mentioned, the pandemic.
Well, to the casual observer, it is hard to discern to what extent the embargo versus Cuba's economic system is responsible for its problems. Here's something out of an NBC News article. Cuba this year produced the lowest amount of sugar, a crop it used to heavily rely upon since 1908. What can you say about that?
Well, I think, yes, that's a problem. You have agricultural issues. There's always the weather, just the world sugar market. And, in the past, sugar has caused wars. In the Spanish-American War, which was started with the Spanish over their practices in Cuba, the U.S. had put a big new tariff on Cuban sugar. And of course, it tanked the Cuban economy, which is even more dependent on sugar than it is now. And so, sugar is very important for their economy. So that's probably another issue in the protests, because these are economically driven protests. And of course, they're also mentioning freedom, and the people there realize they're not free. But the real problem is, you were saying, well, how much of it is sanctions? How much of it is communist inefficiency? I would say that the problem has been communist inefficiency, number one, since 1959, since Castro took power. However, the U.S. sanctions have allowed the regime, I think, to stay in power over 12 presidents, because they can always rely on the Colossus of the North as the boogeyman and blame their inefficiencies on the sanctions. Now, the sanctions have, I would say, have deteriorated over time, simply because as time passes, they find ways of evading them. But also, the United States is, if not unilateral, almost unilateral sanctions. And you have to have cooperation from other countries, because, the new leader of Cuba just went to Britain and France and met with government officials in both countries. So other countries are willing to trade. Canada is willing to trade with Cuba. And if you don't have multilateral sanctions, they can get other suppliers. And so these sanctions that Biden is putting on the defense minister and the Black Wasp Special Forces unit that suppress these protests, they're mainly symbolic, because they're freezing the assets of the defense minister in the United States, of which he probably has none, because none of they've been doing this for decades, and Cuban leaders don't want to put assets in the United States because they know something like this will happen. He can't travel to the United States. And as a spokesman for the Cuban government said, well, he wasn't planning on going on a vacation to the United States anyway. So surprisingly, I think that's probably the way to go, because the sanctions over time have, as I say, their main effect has allowed the communist government to stay in power by blaming the United States for their economic status, which has always been very poor.
You mentioned how Cuba's new president visited Europe. European countries don't seem to agree with the United States that it's necessary to punish Cuba 30 years after the end of the Cold War, because we simply disagree with their form of government. Is that too simple a way of looking at it?
One of the reasons that we put so much pressure on is because Cuba's very short distance off our coast, and we've had a torrid history with Cuba over the years of intervening in their affairs. But the real problem that we have, I think, is the Cuban lobby in South Florida. Now, some of these people have legitimate complaints against, either they were oppressed and fled Cuba by the government, tortured or whatever, or they still have people they know, their relatives or friends, that have been oppressed by the Cuban regime. We have to separate the fact that, yes, the Cuban regime is very oppressive. They're a communist, inefficient government, but the lobby, for 62 years now, this lobby has been very vehement, and they're in a swing state. In U.S. foreign policy, you can't discount domestic factors, and the Cubans in Miami and South Florida are a very potent political force. And this is a swing state, so their votes do matter in a presidential election. And right now, both the Democrats and the Republicans are vying for Cuban votes, and even the Miami-Dade Democratic Party just came out and said more needs to be done. They're pressing their own Democratic president to do more on the sanctions front. So I think what you see is that the Europeans don't have this lobby, and Cuba is not as much of an issue to them because it's not 90 miles off their coast.
When American politicians hear people in other countries shouting for freedom in the streets, they tend to assume those people want the same kind of freedom we have here in the United States. What do Cubans mean when they shout for freedom? Economic liberalization, full political freedom?
Well, I think the new leader has continued Raul Castro's marginally freeing up the economy for small businesses, because the communist system always has to have some sort of event. You saw it even in the Soviet Union when it first, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin had to free up the economy with the new economic policy because the communist system a lot of times just doesn't work. So there's political freedom and then there's economic freedom. I think Cubans have received at least a little bit of economic freedom, but of course, as we see with these protests, they haven't achieved much political freedom. And I think they probably saw what happened in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev came in, he wanted to free up the economy, so he did that a little bit with perestroika, but then bureaucrats in the Soviet government were slow rolling him, so he started glasnost, which was the political reform, and that's really what toppled the whole thing. And many students of communist governments over the decades have said that when you start trying to reform the political system, since communism doesn't have much intrinsic legitimacy, you're liable to topple the whole thing. So I don't think we're going to see political freedom. Now, the Chinese also have a nominally communist system. Now, they did more freeing up the economy, and it's really helped them than the Cubans have, but they still have a tight clamp and are getting tighter in China. So we have to distinguish between those two types of freedom. And I think even though we've seen some marginal economic reforms in Cuba, the political screws are still on the population.
Does the population want a multi-party system? Do they want a softer form of socialism, a less authoritarian form of government, or do they want a full-fledged Western-style democracy?
Well, I think it's hard to say because they've been under communism for 62 years. And Cuba before 1959, that's about all we can look at, was a freewheeling place. It was often crony capitalism. You had the casinos and all the U.S. sugar investments. They've always had dictators. Before Castro, they had a guy named Batista, and he was very corrupt. And that's one of the reasons that Castro was able to take power, because this guy was really corrupt and that sort of thing. So they haven't exactly had a full-blown democracy. I think they would be more apt to get know what to do with economic freedom rather than political freedom. So it might tend toward autocracy with a free economy. It's hard to say where these things settle in if there was a counter-revolution now.
Well, I was going to ask if you believe there's any chance a Cuban protest movement could grow, an opposition movement could grow to potentially topple the regime or challenge the regime. Seems to me something like that would have to come from within, could not be imposed from the outside.
Right. I think you're very right about that. And in fact, it has to. I think it's kind of hard to watch oppression, and Americans don't like to see it. And we also demand quick results. And I don't think this is going to happen overnight, but you do see that there is unrest. And I think the United States allows the regime to have not only a crutch for its economic inefficiencies, but also it can claim, well, any protesters, they're U.S. lackeys. They're being funded from overseas. And of course, even if you have relatives in the United States and you're a Cuban, no country likes to have another country come in and interfere with its system. I think that's why we've had 12 presidents while the communists have been in power since 1959. And so, this regime has been through everything: assassination plots by the U.S., the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was sponsored by the CIA with using Cuban exiles, and it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis eventually. Even before that period, you had a lot of U.S. interventions, and the Spanish-American War was fought over Cuba. And after the Spanish-American War, we did not give Cuba full independence. It was nominally independent, but it was a U.S. protectorate, and there was heavy amounts of U.S. intervention. Now, big powers tend to intervene in their near abroad because they can and because they want to extend their security. It really, I don't know, over time, I think it's better to let the Cubans find their own future. And it may be even a bloody revolution, but sometimes it's better to stay out of it because you inadvertently taint the side you're trying to help.
So to what extent do Cubans, probably older Cubans, remember the history here, how the United States treated this tiny, militarily and economically weak country, especially during the earlier years of the Cold War, 1960s Bay of Pigs, assassination plots against Castro? These are the types of actions that if the shoe were on the other foot, the United States would be calling it acts of terrorism. Is this history still important to ordinary Cubans today?
Yes, well, I think older Cubans do remember the time before the revolution and also certainly the time during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Kennedy in particular was very anti-Castro. I mentioned the Eisenhower administration had developed the CIA plan to overthrow the Cuban government because the revolution happened in early 1959 when Eisenhower was still in power. Kennedy comes in. He's very inexperienced, but he's got to burnish his anti-communist credentials. And he's had a lot of problems looking weak with the Soviet Union, the Berlin crisis in 1961, the Vienna summit where Khrushchev humiliated him, et cetera. So he was spoiling to burnish his anti-communist credentials. So he takes this plan that the Eisenhower developed on the Bay of Pigs, and they get these exiles. They're training them in Central America, and there's stuff in the Cuban papers or stuff in the U.S. papers about what they're doing, and they insist on going ahead with it anyway. And of course, it went nowhere because the idea was to get the Cuban people to launch a counter-revolution when these exiles came ashore. But of course, everybody knew they were going to come ashore, including Fidel Castro. So the whole thing was a big mess. But even after that, the Kennedys were trying to assassinate, unbelievably, just made them redouble their efforts since they were so humiliated. And yes, it even got to comedy where they were trying to develop exploding cigars for Castro's assassination. And one thing, Operation Northwoods, the U.S. military advocated to Kennedy, thank God he didn't do this, but they advocated shooting down a civilian airliner and then blaming it on Castro as a way to launch an invasion of Cuba. And JFK, fortunately, vetoed those types of plans. These things have consequences and can easily go awry when you're trying to invade another culture, because the military can go in, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you can't change the country's culture with military power.
And Bobby Kennedy seemed to be obsessed with Castro. Is that right?
Yes. Both Kennedys, I would say, were fairly obsessed with Castro. The Cuban Missile Crisis was mainly a Monroe Doctrine thing rather than, there was no strategic alteration of balance of power when the Soviets put those missiles in there. I mean, the United States still had missile dominance, overwhelming missile dominance. And, it just cut the time that Soviet missiles would come here in a nuclear war. But since we had no missile defense and still have no reliable missile defense on a strategic level, it wasn't a military thing. It was because the Kennedys hated Castro so much, and also this they regarded as a Monroe Doctrine type of thing. The Soviets were getting into the Western Hemisphere, and in particular, the Monroe Doctrine has concentrated on the Caribbean and Central America. And the Kennedys were also very anti-communist in their outlook. They were Democrats, and they were afraid of being accused of being soft on communism, which goes clear back to Truman losing, in quotes, China in 1949, and then not doing very well in Korea in 1950.
And Barack Obama was criticized by the right wing when he tried to initiate a more sensible approach to Cuba after all these decades of doing it one way. Did you believe Obama's attempt at normalizing relations had any potential?
Obama said at the time, which I think was very correct, is that, we tried this other policy for 60 years, and it really hasn't had the effect that we wanted it to. So why not try something different? Now, if you go toward a more benevolent policy, you have to deal with the lobby in South Florida that's really wed to this, doing the same thing that we've been doing. And you see this, we've had multiple days and weeks of protests in Miami, and that's fine. I think that's freedom of speech here, but both the Democrats and the Republicans in South Florida want more aggressive action. And I think Obama said, that policy hasn't worked, and I think he's right. And so I think a more benevolent approach, which tries to free up the system, because when you start doing commerce between them, people start making money and have an incentive in continuing that relationship. And I don't think you're going to get a lot of political freedom out of that. But eventually, the way things have happened, in Chile and other countries, you can't have a sustained democracy until you get a certain level of income. So if you bring their income level up, which is good for the people of Cuba, maybe you'll eventually get more democratic, probably. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. And people in the political world, which is what we're dealing with here, they don't want to wait that long. They want action. They want it now, and they want to be punitive. So I think Obama had the right idea, but it doesn't seem like Biden is going to follow that, at least right now.
Ivan Eland of the Independent Institute, we thank you for your time today, talking about Cuba, one of the last 5 communist countries on Earth. On the next episode of History as It Happens, when pharmaceutical companies came up with effective vaccines for the coronavirus earlier this year, it appeared the end of the pandemic might be in sight. There was light at the end of the tunnel, but more than halfway through 2021, hospitals are filling up again.
This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
As the Delta variant rages, and it won't be the last variant we see, historian John Barry returns to the podcast as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.